Tavis Piatoli from My Sports Dietitian. I am with Dr. Jordan Moon of FitTrace. We're excited about our webinar tonight on basic body composition. What are we made of? So as we are getting started, we're going to let you guys enter the room, take a little time. You'll have the time to just announce yourself. There's a chat box to your right if you want to type your name and let us know where you're from. At any point throughout the webinar, you guys will have the ability to ask questions. So be sure to put your questions inside this chat box. This will give me the ability while I'm moderating this to, once Dr. Moon has finished his presentation, we'll go through some of your questions and we'll be able to share that with you guys. So again, take your time, announce yourself in the chat box to your right. Let us know where you are, where you're from, who you are, and a little bit about yourself, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Again, for those that are just joining the room, I know we got a lot of people joining. We already got 50 people in the room and got about 320 people registered for the webinar tonight, so really excited about that. And again, take a few moments, announce yourself, let us know where you guys are from. You can just use that chat box to your right, type your name. There's Ashley, and dietitian from Philly, and Mike from LA. Hey, John, got a PhD in the room from University of California, San Francisco. Cool. Awesome. British Columbia, Natalie from Utah, Louise from British Columbia, David. Thank you guys for spending some time with us this evening. Dr. Moon's going to get started shortly. Fairly short webinar tonight. It's not going to be super long, about 20 minutes. And then we're going to leave some time for some questions. Hey, Sylvie. So what I'm going to do now, I'd like to kind of go through a little bit and explain who Dr. Jordan Moon is. So Dr. Moon is an advisor for FitTrace. He's contributed his thought leadership and body composition to the development of FitTrace's software. So he's currently serving as the Executive Director of Research and Education at ImpediMed, where he strategically develops health outcomes and generates data demonstrating the value of the company's technologies. He's also served as an Associate Professor and Program Director for Sports Management and Sports and Health Sciences at American Public University and American Military University. Also, he's a Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist through the National Strength and Conditioning Association, as well as a Certified Exercise Physiologist through the American College of Sports Medicine. Dr. Moon's trained all type of levels of athletes that range from Major League Baseball, National Football League, the National Hockey League. He's published he's presented over 40 lectures at multiple scientific conferences and has published more than 125 research articles, abstracts, and books in over 20 journals. Dr. Moon received his PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Oklahoma, his master's in exercise science and health promotion from Florida Atlantic University, and a bachelor's degree in physical education from Grand Valley State University. He's also currently on faculty at the United States Sports Academy, Concordia University of Chicago, American Public University, and American Military University. So I would like to take the time now to welcome Dr. Jordan Moon. Dr. Moon, thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. Let me know, guys, if you have any issues hearing me or questions regarding specific slides. Go ahead and fire in questions, and we'll handle them at the end. Great to see Dr. Shepard on board here. He's way more of an expert in body composition than I am, so hopefully he can answer some questions at the end of this end of this presentation. So, but anyway, I'm going to be talking today just about basic body composition, and this is really part of a series of webinars that we want to do to kind of educate everybody out there who's interested in body composition, just what it is, the different methods, and I guess variability mainly, and ways to interpret and help anybody who's dealing with body composition. So this main first lecture is really going to be the basics, and I know you're going to have a lot of questions after this, and we'll get into it at the end regarding where you guys think we want or where you want to see this webinar series go. We have a list of about 12 different webinars we want to do, but in terms of priority and order and what you want to see, this is really one of a series that we want to do that we'll be doing over the next, hopefully 6 months and maybe longer after that. So we'll get into it now. So really what we're trying to figure out what we're made of when we're talking about body composition. So from a basic perspective, if we think about the food we eat, the meat we eat, it kind of gives us a level of understanding. So if we think about hemoglobin and myoglobin being water and protein and the oxygen carrying component of the muscle, compared to blood, which has hemoglobin, which carries the oxygen. Once you cut a piece of steak here, say, there's really no more blood or hemoglobin in it. Really, the redness and the juice is coming from fluids, water, and the colors coming from the myoglobin. So the amount of water in our body is really abundant, and we're going to kind of talk about that today. So I was talking about hemoglobin, myoglobin being the oxygen carrying component of muscle instead of hemoglobin. And on a side note, I just wanted to, we're going to be talking about how much water's in our body and where it's located and that kind of thing. But one reason you want to freeze your meat slower or faster than slower is because of all the water that is in meat. The slower that it freezes, the greater the size of the ice crystals, and those will actually puncture cell walls and can dry out your meat. So the worst thing you can do is slowly freeze your meat. So a lot of these high-end sushi places use negative 80-degree freezers to actually freeze their meats super fast. So another thing related to meat here, I want to talk about really briefly the difference in mixed fiber versus single fiber types of meat. And I'm not sure if you guys know, and this isn't basic physiology, but there's dark meat and light meat and mixed meat, and beef is a mixed meat, whereas, say, a chicken breast and a chicken leg are dark meat and light meat. And if you look at a duck breast, it's usually really dark red, and that's because of the myoglobin, whereas a chicken breast is really much, much lighter because it has much less myoglobin. When you think of a duck is flying using a lot of oxidation, flying constantly, whereas a chicken is running around constantly using its legs more, and it only has to flap its wings and fly real quickly when it's running away from a predator, but it's not flying through the sky. We don't see chickens flying through the skies like ducks. So the water in our meat is somewhere between 64 to 72%, depending on what kind of meat it is. So salmon's going to be closer to 64%, and beef's going to be closer to your 72%. But the main thing I want to focus on is, what are we made out of? We're mostly made out of water, and what we're going to be talking about is kind of where that's located, and a little bit later. So when we think about fat and fat-free mass as part of our body composition, which most people are interested in, the fat and the fat-free mass components, we break the body down into two compartments when we think of it this way. And we think of it as a fat compartment, which is lipid molecules, and we think of it as a fat-free mass compartment, which is also basically the rest, which is water, protein, mineral, carbohydrates, and basically all assume everything inside your fat-free mass. So everything other than pure lipid molecules. So we have this assumed chemical constancy, but we know that this is not really constant between different sexes, different races, different ages, different fitness levels, as well as different fatnesses. So when you're looking at a two-compartment model, such as a bod pod or underwater weighing, breaking the body into two components, or two compartments, and we're making some major assumptions about chemical constancy of these compartments. And that's what we're going to kind of talk about here a little bit, is what we're assuming. So how does body composition change with hydration? So we know that water is found in fat and lean tissues. We know that over time, changes in water are reflected in both tissues. And when we're talking about the difference in tissues and molecules, I want you to understand that they're really not the same thing. They're absolutely, by definition, not the same thing. So when we talk about, say, the previous slide, fat and fat-free mass, we're talking about molecules here, whereas we don't always think about composition in terms of molecules. So we think about it in terms of tissue, because our bodies are made of molecules and tissue. So when we're talking about composition, often we talk about tissues. So one tissue that we talk about a lot is adipose tissue, which does contain a good amount of fat, but it's also a form of connective tissue which stores energy as fat. But it's not just the fat, it's not just the lipid, it's not just a molecule, it's everything. It's the connective tissue, blood supply, and nerves, and everything that supplies that fat, that allows that fat to grow in your body or shrink, depending on what you're doing. So fat's also everywhere in our body. Most of our brain is fat. We have it throughout our body. We have it all over our organs, throughout our entire body. And when we break the body down into two components and two compartments, into fat and fat-free mass, we're quantifying every single molecule of fat. And I want you to remember that this is a living person that's changing, minute by minute, but we're also quantifying something in a living human at the molecular level, and it's extremely hard to do. So when you spend $30 on a scale, it's hard to say that this scale is quantifying every molecule of fat, but that's really what it's saying. It's when it says this is your percent fat, it's saying I have quantified every molecule of fat, and I've quantified every other thing, which is your fat-free mass. But if we know your fat mass and we know your total mass, and we can calculate your fat-free mass very easily using a pretty simple equation down here, which is the two-compartment model, which is fat equals total mass and fat-free mass. So from a basic level, we're really splitting you down into molecules here. And when we talk about adipose tissue, it's not just fat. There's a lot more going on. There's different types of adipose tissue. We have subcutaneous adipose tissue, and we have visceral adipose tissue. And as many of you may know, visceral adipose tissue is the one that's highly related to increase in obesity, pro-inflammatory. It's higher in men. It's related to cardiovascular disease. There's a lot of negative side effects to having a large amount of visceral adipose tissue. But when you look at subcutaneous and visceral, in terms of total fat, about 60 to 90% of your adipose tissue is actually subcutaneous fat. So when you're looking at an athlete, you're looking at yourself, you're looking at a client, you're looking at anybody you want to quantify fat, and you ask yourself, where's this fat going to change? Yes, it's going to change in the visceral area, but the subcutaneous area, which is all around us under our skin, is going to change the most, and that's where most of our fat is. This is one reason why skin fold calipers, which actually pinch subcutaneous adipose tissue and measure only subcutaneous adipose tissue, can relatively accurately calculate total body fat, because it's making the assumption that most of your fat is in your subcutaneous area. So that where we run into issues with skin folds is if somebody has a huge visceral area of fat and a small subcutaneous area. So these skinny fat guys with this big old beer belly and no subcutaneous fat, it's going to be less accurate for skin folds. So just remember, we have adipose tissue in multiple areas of our body and different types of adipose tissue. And this changes within individuals. You go through exercise, nutritional interventions, and you lose this visceral and subcutaneous fat. And we don't really know, unless we're doing MRIs or detailed scanning techniques, we can't really quantify the difference between subcutaneous and visceral fat. Some machines can do it, but with prediction equations, but really the only way to do this is with CT and MRI, and that's just not practical. It also varies between individuals. We see different athletes, different fitness level. You're going to have different subcutaneous fat and different visceral fat. So muscle mass, stepping away right now from fat for a little, there's different types of muscle mass in our body. It's found around our organs. Most what we're talking about in body composition is skeletal muscle mass. So it's not the smooth muscle, it's not the cardiac muscle. That is important. It's not really changing though. You can't impact that like you can skeletal muscle mass by exercising and diet and things like that. So really focusing on skeletal muscle mass. And skeletal muscle mass can change with age, diet, and training. We probably all know, are aware of this or have experienced this ourselves. So muscle contains anywhere from 68 to 80% water. It's around 20 to 33% protein, got a little bit of fat in it, and about 75% is located in the arms and the legs. But yes, we have some muscle in our torso holding up our spine and our pecs and our back and in that area. But most of the muscles in the arms and the legs, and the other thing to consider in the arms and the legs is there's no other organs in the arms and the legs. That's all in the trunk. Skeletal muscle mass is not equal to fat-free mass. Another thing that a lot of people think is, if I'm increasing my fat-free mass, I'm increasing my skeletal muscle mass. that may not be the case. And the reason for that is your fat-free mass actually contains your water, and we're going to talk about that now. The skeletal muscle, yes, contains water, but can you modify the 68 to 80% without actually improving the quality or the volume of actual skeletal muscle protein? You can, but also consider that the tissue, the muscle tissue itself, does contain water. So it is part of muscle, unless it's dry muscle, and that's a whole different thing. So when we talk about skeletal muscle mass, we have to assume that there's a certain amount of water associated with that skeletal muscle mass. Now, by overhydrating and dehydrating or doing some different training and dietary interventions, you can actually manipulate the content of water in your muscle, which can significantly alter body composition measurement tests and actually interact with medication and other things like that. But performance and overall health can be related as well. So going back to the meat example, we grade our meat based on intermuscular fat. So if you look at this cut of meat on the right side, you see that, based on select, which is a slight amount of fat, versus a prime, which is an abundant amount of intermuscular fat. And this is something that does change between individuals, and this can change with training, and this is variable depending on the type of muscle and which muscle it is in your body. So there is some fat and muscle too. So when we talk about skeletal muscle mass, we're actually talking about skeletal muscle mass plus a little bit of fat. And in this example, there's about 2.2% fat and lipids in your skeletal muscle mass. Now, if you're talking about pure muscle mass, then that's what we call intramuscular adipose tissue free skeletal muscle mass. So it's a long word, or a long definition there, but it is basically muscle mass minus their intramuscular fat. That's pure protein. But we don't talk that way unless you're in the research and you're actually reporting that value, and you can calculate that value with CT, MRI, and a couple other prediction equations. But when the general public talks about muscle mass, we're actually talking about there's a little fat in that muscle mass at a tissue level, but not when I'm talking about a two-compartment model, because the two-compartment model takes away every molecule of fat. So when I'm talking about fat-free mass, it's pure muscle mass, and it's not the fat. The fat has been taken into the fat mass compartment. So it may be confusing, but we're talking about the difference between a molecular two-compartment model and tissue composition changes, and what the difference is in these tissues. And what I really want you to understand is that the tissue is what's variable. The molecules are obviously as variable too, but when we look at people, we talk about muscle mass, we talk about fat mass. We're really talking about adipose tissue and muscle mass as it is a tissue, not as it in its molecular form, which most of the devices we use do. There's obviously individual variability between the same individual and between individuals and different types of athletes. You have endurance runners that have much lower amounts of muscle mass, and you have bodybuilders, strength trainers, more anaerobic power, strength, and power athletes who have much larger amounts of muscle mass. So this is something that varies between individuals. And obviously, one thing we can change that we've seen is fat. And we can also change muscle. It's a little harder, but really the only thing that stays consistent in adults is the bone content, and which is only about 4% of your total mass, and really doesn't change. So you can change bone mineral density, but it's not really going to change. And Dr. Shepard, if he's still on here, he can go into a lot more information. He's pretty much the expert in all things body composition, bone related. But here I'm just trying to make you realize that bone stays the same. The only thing we're really changing is fat and fat-free mass. And within those two components, and those specific molecular compartments, we have tissues that overlap. And the problem with that is total body water is in all of them. It's in adipose tissue, it's in skeletal muscle mass, it's in blood, and it's in our organs, and it's everywhere. Water is nearly 5 times more water in muscle than any other organ or tissue. So as we're changing muscle mass, that water compartment is also going to change significantly because water is such a main contributor to muscle mass. It doesn't mean that when I change adipose tissue that water is not going to change. And the problem with adipose tissue, we'll get into that in a second. Getting ahead of myself. So water's in all these tissues, right? It's not in fat-free, not in fat mass. It's only in our fat-free mass. But when I look at a tissue, a adipose tissue or muscle tissue, water's included, and we turn water over all the time. About 9% of our body water is turned over per day, and this depends on the individual. So I know some individuals with this is almost twice, or closer to 20% of their body water is turned over per day. And this depends on how much you're drinking, how much you're eating, your diet, and exercise, and things like that. But this is really just a general example here about how much percent per hour you're turning over. And you got to look, in about 2.5 hours, you've turned over 1% of your total body water. So you're going through your body water. You're very dynamic. Your tissues are dynamic. But every time you take a body composition, we're making these assumptions that you're in the same state, that your water is constant, your tissue water is constant. So that's kind of what I want to talk about from this basic body composition perspective, is the variability in body water. And as you see, as you age, if you look at the middle column here, total body water minus fat-free mass. So this is the density. It's not minus, it's the density of fat-free, density of water, the amount of water in your fat-free mass. And you can see as you age, the older you get, the less water is a part of your fat-free mass. And the issue is here, this chemical constancy, this known assumption that my fat-free mass has X liters of water or has X percent of water. And a lot of the devices that we use, BodPod underwater weighing, DEXA, they all assume this chemical constancy. And when we look at the research and we come up with these, say, the known assumption, this chemical constancy, this constant value is, in this case, you can see from these specific cadavers, they calculated that 73.7% of their fat-free mass was water. And that's what BodPod uses. That's what DEXA uses, underwater weighing, and our two-compartment models. The problem is, as you can see in this, not all the cadavers were 73.7%. One was 80.8%, and another one was 68.6%. And what we find is this ratio, this water in fat-free mass, ranges from 68 to 81%. And again, you're changing on a daily basis. You're changing every hour this ratio slightly. So the question is, if I'm getting measured, if I'm having my fat mass and fat-free mass measured by a device, is my fat-free mass hydration the same every time I'm doing it? And is this changing with my diet and nutrition and exercise? If I add a bunch of muscle, if I lose a bunch of fat, did that change my fat-free mass hydration? These are things that we're trying to answer that we don't really know, but we're just making assumptions. So at least total body water seems to be somewhat constant. So it does range, but it does tend to stay relatively constant, but we don't know the small minor changes. So throughout age, once you're an adult, throughout, into your 80s and 90s, you still have a good 73.7% of your fat-free mass is water. As if you see here in this middle column, total body water divided by fat-free mass, 73.5, 73.5, 73.4. You see it's relatively constant over age. But again, it really depends on the individual, depends on what you're looking at. So let me go back here one more time. And when we look at a two-compartment model, it's looking at densities of tissue, and fat-free mass density is related to water. Or water density is 1, right? And your fat-free mass density is 1.1. So the more dehydrated you are, the more dense your fat-free mass will be, and vice versa. So you can significantly influence these two-compartment models. When you break the body down into fat mass and fat-free mass, you can significantly influence those models by manipulating this dynamic component of your composition, which is water. To what extent that it actually impacts these measures is really just finding out. There's been a few studies recently, and I can get into this in a lot more detail later on in future webinars. But really, the bottom line here is body water is very highly variable throughout each individual, between individuals, and throughout the day. And when you look at tissues, they're very different than the molecular component when you're looking at body composition. So going forward, when we're talking about tissues and we're talking about multi-compartment models and 2, 3, and 4 compartment models and things like that, we're going to talk about molecular categorization or molecular breakdowns versus tissue breakdowns. And some devices such as DEXA, MRI, and CT look at tissue versus two-compartment models that may look at the molecular component, or even 4-compartment models that look at molecular compartments. So they're not all created equal, but one thing we know for sure is water is most of our body, and it is highly dynamic. It's found almost in all of our tissues. Fat is also found everywhere in our body. And again, when I break the body down into fat molecules, I'm quantifying every molecule of fat in my entire body, which is hard to do when I dissect you and break it down that way, let alone in a living human. It's just very hard to do. So just keep that in mind when you're getting on a device or hearing a value of 14.2% and then it goes to 14%. How valuable is 0.2% fat, considering the major assumptions that we have to make in addition to quantifying that large amount of fat mass at the molecular level? Tissues molecules are not the same. Both muscle and fat tissues contain water. Most body water is found in the muscle, about 5 times more than any other organ or tissue. About 9% of your water is being lost per day. And the water content of fat-free mass does change with age, diet, training, medication, etc. It can range from 68 to 81%. And this is not something we can measure through urine color, specific gravity, or a two-compartment model. We have to actually have a total body water measurement and another measurement, a two-compartment model, in order to identify how much actual water is in that fat-free mass. It's not something I can do with one device typically. So we're talking about really kind of a difficult calculation that is the most fundamental to the basics of body composition if you really want to know and be accurate what's going on at the molecular level, and to see and to understand what's going on with the tissue level. So for that, I know it's a lot, but wanted to open it up for any questions. I had another slide here, but for some reason you guys couldn't see that one, so I had to put it down. But My Sports Dietitian is going to be putting this on their website for you to download and for you to review, as well as FitTrace. They're going to be putting something on their website. FitTrace is a company that provides service for DEXA scans if you guys are interested in that. But both My Sports D and FitTrace will have some information there. If you email questions at fittrace.com, you can submit questions following this if I don't get a chance to answer them, as well as any suggestions you have on direction of future webinars. Like I said, this is one very small initial component to a much larger, broader understanding of how to use body composition at a clinical level, at a athletic level, It's just we need to understand basics. We need to understand the difference in molecules and tissues, and the basics of a two-compartment model and the variability of water. So going forward, we can talk about how things like loading up on creatine or depleting glycogen or things like this can actually impact body composition and give you false information about muscle mass and things that are actually going on. So the goal is to help you interpret your data with a better understanding of really what's going on physiologically and biologically. And then we're going to obviously get to ways that you can help reduce these errors and get a better quantification of these tissues or molecular components that we really want to talk about, and then ultimately allow you to utilize that information down the road to impact clients and patients and athletes. So with that, I guess we'll open it up to some questions.
That was great. Thank you so much, Dr. Moon, and very impressive. And I'm excited about working with FitTrace moving forward with a lot of these webinars, and we're looking to expand that relationship. And we do have some great questions. First question actually comes from, I think, Ronnie. Let me go back because we got a few more questions kind of come in, and let me go back and pull his question up and find that. All right. So one of the questions that we have is trying to measure muscle mass or body fat on an adolescent worth the effort? And if so, what is the most practical way to do so? And I think what Ronnie's saying is, he's got a lot of athletes in his training room, and a lot of these parents and kids today are thinking body fat. They're 14, 15 years of age. So where do you start that process?
Well, I mean, there's a device called a P-Pod, which tests infants, and you really can start anytime. The question is how valuable you think that data is, and how you're interpreting that data. That I think a lot of people get in trouble with. So, Dr. Jeff Stout was my mentor, and he's really focused during my PhD. He was my mentor and still my mentor. But most of his nutritional, he's got a book out there on nutrition for children. Most of his area of thought there is kids are going to grow no matter what. I mean, you can starve a kid almost completely and they're still going to grow. And there's so much going on outside of nutrition that makes it difficult to identify the effectiveness of an intervention, whether it's dietary or exercise. So usually what we're trying to do from a body composition perspective in children is just to make sure that we're not going too aggressive in any certain direction. So if they're losing way too much fat too fast, that's unhealthy, then we can do body composition. If they're an overweight or obese child, that's something we would want to monitor. And then same thing with, more adolescents in terms of a 14 or 15-year-old starting a strength training program, and all of a sudden there's this huge increase in lean mass, and things like that we want to monitor. And obviously you can use use body composition to monitor for potential issues with anorexia and other eating disorders, just to make sure that things are going the way that they're normally supposed to be going. So again, the issue is there's so much variability in their fat-free mass hydration ratio and the dynamic nature, and they're already growing skeletal structure, muscle, and fat. That makes it really hard to pin down any one specific method. And we'll get into more methods later in webinars, but if you are going to test this population, really the main thing to do is to use as few assumptions as possible. So if you're using, say, skin fold calipers and you're looking at subcutaneous adipose tissue thickness and you're not converting that to anything, that becomes valuable. Same thing with circumferences, things like that are going to be more anthropometric based, I feel is going to give you more insight to really what's going on in a healthy population. Now, in a disease population, a clinical population, there may be a lot more value to MRIs and CTs and other advanced methods like that. But then you got things like DEXA, which have been used in children, but then you have radiation exposure issues, even though it's a very, very small amount, very minimal, less than flying across the country. So it's one thing just to really consider that.
Another question we got was, are you familiar with the SECA machine That's a 4-compartment that includes hydration. If so, can you discuss?
So the Sika machine is based on a 4-compartment model. It's not a 4-compartment model itself. So they make a few different claims, but ultimately it's a multi-frequency bioimpedance machine, and it uses prediction equations based on a 4-compartment model. So a lot of these bioimpedance devices, like the scale you can buy for $30 that looks from leg to leg, sending a single frequency signal, that device is predicting based on your age, height, weight, sex, and the impedance value that it gets. It's predicting some other criterion value. So that would be, say, a cheap scale usually predicts a underwater weighing or 2-compartment model value, or it predicts DEXA. So it's basically using an equation to predict you as part of a population from that criterion model. So it's basically, it takes 200 people underwater weighing, right? And see how well this impedance, height, weight, and age can predict using a specific equation. Then when you stand on that scale, it uses all that information to predict that one value from that group of 100, theoretically. So what the Sika device does is, instead of using underwater weighing as the gold standard there to predict, it uses a multi-compartment model. It uses a 4-compartment model as the body composition, the body fat. But a 4-compartment model doesn't include arm muscle mass, leg muscle mass. So the criterion for that, for the Sika, I believe, is MRI. So it used MRI, muscle mass of the arms and legs. So when you get on the Sika, it uses more than one frequency. It uses a handful of frequencies. I think they may use 20 frequencies to predict your right arm muscle mass based on a population. So that's what we call an indirect method. So if I'm using a device that predicts my composition based on a population, it's usually relatively accurate, but the problems come in when we have these small changes in hydration and fluid and things like that. So most of our bioimpedance-based devices use these algorithms and these equations to predict based on a population, which the population is not always consistent with who you are or the group that you're measuring. For example, Sika's in a lot of clinical use right now in maybe hospitals and other areas, but they're also bridging into sports nutrition. So you have to ask Sika, and I haven't asked them, but how many pro athletes, if that's the population you're testing, were part of their equation development group, and does that equation development group reflect necessarily that type of population that you're measuring? And this is why you see in a lot of these devices there's like athlete mode and normal mode, and the only difference is the type of population that was used to help them predict. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Another question. So all the data about water, total body weight, fat-free mass, is this based on those very small samples, since 68 to 81% came from only 9 cadavers?
So that's data that we've seen over decades of research. So that 68 to 80% is just a general rule. We've seen it higher than that in most cases, and I've presented this on this before. In most cases, individuals are around 2% plus or minus that 73.8% or 73.7. They're around plus or minus 2%. So what we don't really know, because it's not easy to do to calculate the hydration of fat-free mass, is if certain populations and certain samples, certain types of athletes, say strength and power athletes versus endurance athletes, we don't really know who may be slightly more at the higher percentage or the lower percentage. And the hard thing is, I presented on this last summer, is nothing about their urinary indices of hydration are related to the fat-free mass hydration at a single level. So I can look at somebody who has really dehydrated urine, or their urine suggests they're really dehydrated, or urine that suggests they're very hydrated. And both of those people could have 73.4% of their fat-free masses is water. So it's hard to use a single measure of urine to predict that fat-free mass hydration level. And this is something I'd get into in a future lecture, because I have a lot of data looking at this and kind of where this data comes from. And we're looking at all of the studies that have done multi-compartment models and looked at different populations. Myself looking at Division I collegiate female athletes, they were all around 73.7, 73.8%. But we had a range in that study, I think 70 to 78, somewhere in there. So it's not necessarily you're always going to see the extremes. The problem is we don't know how to identify. We can't look at somebody and say, oh yeah, you're 78. Oh yeah, you're 68. We can't do that. So it's really hard for us right now from a body composition measurement perspective to identify outside of that chemical constancy. So the best thing we can do is either have a measure of total body water and do a multi-compartment model, which they're becoming easier to do thanks to the work of Dr. Shepard and his work with DEXA. But it's something you can't measure. And one way and one reason we always tell our athletes, and when you're doing body composition, you should measure urine and you should look at that specific gravity. You should look at that color, because if it is changing in the same person from time point A to time point B, then that could be an indicator of something, a difference in their fat-free mass hydration. The problem is we don't really know right now, but more than likely if it's changing within the same individual, it is. But between individuals, we can't use that urine right now as a marker of that fat-free mass hydration. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, how accurate is handheld BIA?
So again, you're talking about a $30, $40 device quantifying every fat molecule in your body.
Yep.
using a single frequency prediction equation to compare you basically to someone that's similar age, sex, race, height, weight, and has a similar impedance value. So it's a device that's already slightly limited to the upper body using a single frequency, and now it's using a prediction equation, and it's trying to quantify every molecule of fat in my body. So I'm not going to give a number. We're going to get into that later, but let's just say that research shows that it's most of the time those single frequency devices are not of practical use, meaning it doesn't track the right way. It doesn't track accurately enough. And a single measurement can be, somewhere. I'm not going to get into it, but let me just say this. You looking at that person is just as accurate as some of those scales and some of those single frequency devices. The number that you think they are may be actually more accurate than some of those devices, and they've actually done a little research in that. So
Gotcha.
it's if you're looking at raw impedance values, those are good, but most people don't know how to interpret that, and a lot of people are having issues with just the understanding of how to interpret raw impedance values. So it's such a big field, and there's so much information. That's why I want to start this lecture with basically just basics, difference in tissue and molecular concepts and basic tissue that we're looking at and basic molecules that we're looking at. And we really want to get into all the different methods and the assumptions they make, ways to improve, and different methods that you can really rely on. As much as I want to get into all of those different methods today, I can assure you that down the road we will talk about every single method, including the 3D scanners and things like that are coming up, and as well as the Sculpt devices and all these new devices out there for body composition. But at the end of the day, I don't want to tell you what you should use or how you should use it, or if something is good or something is bad. I hope that you'll be able to understand enough and make these decisions on your own based on just the general physiology. of the human body and the biology of quantifying every fat molecule. Is that something that you can do with a $100 device that you slap on your body a couple times? So there's just, use your best judgment now and really try and understand, just kind of use your own judgment and understanding how variable your water is on a daily basis, and how every time you get in a bod pod, every time you do a skin fold, every time you do any DEXA scan or any body composition that's not a multi-compartment model, it's assuming your fat-free mass hydration is identical. So if I do it in the morning and I do it at the night, in the evening, and I've been fasting all day, I may have lost 6% of my water that day, and I'm going to get in a device that's going to tell me something totally different than in the morning. And I think a lot of people are turned off by a lot of these body composition devices that have promise, but yet they rely so much on this value being reliable throughout the day when their body isn't reliable throughout the day. And everybody knows that. I mean, you may feel better in the morning and in the afternoon, or you have a really hard workout and you have some fluid buildup, or you drank a bunch of alcohol and you're dehydrated, or you're retaining water. There's all these factors that play into composition measurements, and they just violate the assumptions. And I don't think people realize that. And that's a whole nother lecture webinar that we're going to give in terms of how to improve and what things to avoid and ways to really get the best out of your measurements.
Just a couple of more questions, Jordan. This one's a little bit different in regards to body comp. What do you think about using circumference measurements like the Navy or YMCA models?
So any anthropometric measure is going to be tied in that same category as an indirect method if you're converting those values to fat mass and fat-free mass or percent fat. When you take a circumference and you take a skin fold, you take any anthropometric measurement, whether it's a breadth or girth or whatever, and you convert that raw value into a two-compartment model, which is fat mass and fat-free mass, you're making a huge amount of assumptions based on the molecular composition of that fat and the rest of your fat-free mass there. So I like anthropometric measurements, but I don't like the conversion of them. So if you're doing circumferences, you're doing skin folds, that's great. But why do you need to convert that into fat mass? Why do you need to try and convert a 12 millimeter skin fold thickness of a tricep into all molecules in your entire body? So if you do that, remember the assumptions that you're making, and there is value in that. If you're using, say, the Jackson-Pollock skin fold equations, those don't use height, or those don't use age and other variables other than sex. So, they don't use weight, which is weight itself accounts for 70% of the variability in your body composition as is. So if I put weight into an equation, I can count for well over half of what your composition is going to be. So the Jackson and Pollock skin fold equations, or I'm not familiar with the Y. I haven't worked with them in a while, but I know the military is circumference based and predicts fat mass, whereas Jackson and Pollock skin fold is a two-compartment model representing your subcutaneous fat. So it's not going to tell you everything that's going on inside the body and out. It's going to tell you how your subcutaneous fat is affecting your total body fat. So I'll get into this more detail and easy ways to measure changes in muscle and changes in fat using simple circumferences and simple skin folds. So, and I'm really not opposed to any person doing anything that they're currently using, as long as they understand the variability in it, in the person and in the device themselves. If they're not using the device properly, if they're testing the person all different times of the day, if the person is not right for that device, there's so many variables. If they understand that and they're interpreting their data with that assumption and that understanding, then I'm okay with you using a $50 scale or whatever. Just know that you may need to lose 10 pounds before that device tells you that there's an actual change in percent fat, before that device is actually telling you something that's true. So a lot of times with basic stuff, you can see with your own eyes, and people can feel with their own clothes. Hey, the shirt's tighter. I'm gaining more muscle. I'm getting bigger in my upper body. These pants are lighter. I must be losing fat. They see that and feel that before most of the cheap devices out there. So, and there's some really more advanced devices that people have access to, like DEXA, which can be extremely useful in quantifying muscle mass and fat mass, specifically in the arms and the legs, which other devices can't do. So there's value in almost everything out there, as long as you interpret it correctly and understand what you're doing. Is there something that's more valuable? Probably. Is it necessarily valuable if you have other options? Maybe not, but I don't throw anything out the door if you're currently doing it. I just hope that you make an informed decision on it.
Last two questions. One, I think you already kind of answered. Cheryl had a question about the in-body 230, decent or not great. And you may have answered that when regarding the questions on BIA earlier.
So, yeah, I mean, it's the same thing as Sika. It's the 230 uses less frequencies than the Sika. It's less advanced. It's making more assumptions. So you have BIA devices that are $30, and you have BIA devices like the Sika and the in-body 770 that are upwards of $20,000. The only difference is how many frequencies they're using and how big was the population that they used and how good the prediction equations are. Typically, the higher end is going to give you better prediction equations and more segments and things like that. But if you're not normally hydrated, then that device isn't going to work for you. Or if you're coming in hydrated one day and abnormally hydrated another day, any bioimpedance device is really based on fluid. It's sending low-level electrical signal through you at usually 50 kilohertz. Most devices range somewhere between 3 and 1,000 kilohertz. And we're measuring the resistance of that current in ohms, and then we convert those ohms. We use those ohms in a prediction equation with age, height, weight, etc. Company I work for, ImpediMed, uses bioimpedance spectroscopy, which uses 256 different frequencies and actually uses a mathematical model instead of prediction equations to measure extracellular and intercellular fluid. But then once we get those two, we add those together to get total body composition or total body water. And then from total body water, we use the same 73 for converting total body water to fat-free mass. You use 73.2 instead of 73.8. But it's the same assumption. Whenever you get a device that can, quantify circumference, quantify skin fold thickness, quantify total body water, whenever you convert those raw values to tissue without using a multi-compartment model, you're significantly increasing the reliance on that chemical constancy. And that's where we just run into a lot of our issues. So I can't say that Sika is better than the 230 because in the person you're testing, maybe the 230 is better than the Sika. There's so many variables and you just can't answer everything and you don't really know. So it makes it really hard, and there's some problems with some of the companies, misinformation and things like that. And there's all sorts of misinformation on the internet trying to, make these assumptions or make these claims that one value on one device for one individual is indicative of some certain chronic illness. And it's just that we just can't do that. We can predict, we can give you ratio, we can give you odds, we can do a lot of that. But if I'm making all these assumptions based on the molecular content of the fat volume at a molecular level, there's just too much assumptions being made. So it's hard to say. And there's studies there's literally hundreds of body composition papers that are published on a monthly basis, if not on a biweekly basis. So most of the body composition research is hard. It's hard to utilize because it's so limited. So stuff out of Dr. Shepard's lab is fantastic, and there's some really good publications coming out of some other labs out of Australia and Portugal, and some other labs in the U.S. that I've been working with for a long time. But just to compare the InBody 230 to a DEXA and say, oh yeah, it works, it's equivalent to a DEXA. It's like, well, maybe DEXA is not perfect either because it's assuming the same 73.8% hydration. So now what do we do? So it's a device that predicts another device that already has errors. So any time you're dealing with an indirect device like an impedance device, there's going to be more errors than if you're looking at raw measurements. And again, we get into that in a lot more detail in a separate, entirely separate webinar talking about indirect body composition measurement versus more direct laboratory-based measurement.
This will be our last question for the night. I think you may have even touched on it earlier towards the end of the webinar, but question was by David. Is DEXA body scanning hazardous? I understand it uses a small amount of radiation to measure bone density. What's the next best alternative?
So in adults, I mean, they've done tons of research in adults. I mean, literally tens of thousands of adults have been measured with DEXA scans, and they've done a lot of research in children. The only limiting factor regarding radiation in DEXA scan is if you're pregnant, and that's because we don't really understand the impacts of radiation on an unborn fetus. So that's really the limiting factor there. But again, it's about the same radiation as an extra day. There's background radiation all around us, right? Your computer gives it off. Different altitudes give it off. Just background radiation for most Americans is one DEXA scan, which takes about 10 minutes or so, depending on how big you are, is about the equivalent of an extra day of life. So it's really very small. Or like I said earlier, flying across country. So in a jet, you're getting a lot more radiation. So it's equivalent flying across country. They let women fly across country that are pregnant. So it's really not hazardous at all unless you maybe have some sort of health condition. It does measure bone. That's what it was created for. That's its best measurement tool, measurement tissue there. It's a two-dimensional scan. It gives you a bone mineral density, but it's aerial bone mineral density. It's actually surface density. So it's not a three-dimensional image. It's not a voxel. It's a pixel. So MRI and CT are going to be better at quantifying tissue than DEXA, but DEXA has its values. It's much easier to do. There's a lot of centers all over. FitTrace has been focusing on a lot of the work that John Shepard has done, Dr. Shepard's done, in terms of using that DEXA data to predict certain health outcomes or even performance. And there's a lot coming out in athletic populations, so you can compare your DEXA values with another an NFL team, say. The problem with DEXA is you have multiple DEXA brands, mostly you have three brands. You have GE, Hologic, and Norlin, and they don't all equal. If you took a measure on all three devices, they're all going to be slightly different. And different GE models, different Hologic models, different Norlin models are different within the same brand, and different software gives you different values. So cross-calibration between devices is something that's been a requirement for DEXA since they came out in the early 90s. So if you go to a DEXA center, make sure you go to that same one every time, because if you go to a different testing center across the world or across the country, and they're using a different DEXA and different software, your data is not necessarily going to line up. So FitTrace is working on actually converting the data based on different software, but that's a cross-calibration thing. And there's DEXAs that are on the back of trucks. People put them in the back of a truck in California and drive it out to a local CrossFit, and people show up and get a DEXA scan in the back of a truck. It's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's not going to be hazardous per se, but is that value going to be the same as a brick and mortar DEXA that has a little bit more control over the reliability of that machine? So there's a lot of things to consider. The next best alternative to DEXA, and again, in a future webinar, we can get into a lot more detail about different methods and things like that. But it depends on what you're looking at, or do you want to look at bone? Then really, you got to go with the DEXA. How important is bone, though? I mean, we've seen really in athletes and Hank Lukaski, I wrote a chapter in his last book, body composition book. It's a great book, looking at different athletes and specifically endurance athletes and looking at the difference in bone density. And the reality is really only cyclists have a reduced bone density. All the other types of sports, even swimming, they're all about the same as normal individuals. And then obviously your strength and power athletes and your runners and those high impact load bearing sports, you're going to have greater bone mineral density. So if you're not at risk for low, like a cyclist, you really need to know bone. And how often do you need to know bone? And bone is really important in your teenage years and as you're growing up, especially with female athlete triad and other related health issues relating to eating disorders. So it is something that you may want to monitor. So again, it's not hazardous at all. And if anybody says that, they don't really know anything about radiation. It's such a low level exposure. I mean, you could, if you wanted to, and I have this data, it's pretty ridiculous, but if you could pretty much have a DEXA scan multiple times a day, every day, and still not get enough radiation that to be outside of what's considered acceptable for those that work in a field of radiation. So if you work in a field that's exposed to radiation, there's a certain level that you can have that's acceptable. And you literally have to do multiple DEXA scans a day in order to even come close to getting to that value, but you'd still be underneath it. So it's such a small amount of radiation.
Well, I think that was the last question. That was a great job and got a lot of good feedback. We're looking forward to future webinars. Dr. Moon, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us today, and we're looking forward to having you back in the future.
Thanks, guys. And again, questions at FitTrace.com if you have any further questions or any suggestions for future webinars. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the folks at FitTrace for working with us to host this. Well, we're looking to work with them again. Great company, and we will see you guys soon. Again, remember, if you didn't, we apologize about some of the little technical difficulties earlier. We're glad we were able to resolve that pretty quickly. But also, you will have a chance within the next 12 hours to watch the replay. We'll also have it on our website, so you can download it anytime and sign up to watch it. But you will get an email with the replay and get all that information. So thank all you guys for attending tonight, and we'll see you guys very soon. Y'all have a great night.